Hey guys, in this lecture we are going to be doing style guide and coding convention. I know this is not mainly JavaScript per se from the language, but it's extremely important that the next generation of programmers know this because there is a standard that we have in the industry, and it becomes easier for everyone in the industry to understand, learn, write, and even read code when everyone follows a particular standard. Just like when we do driving, everyone knows what a left hand signal means, or everyone knows when you see the red color you have to stop the car. Similarly, JavaScript has its own unsaid language, and that's the coding standards that we have. So we'll just talk briefly about what the coding standards are and why it's necessary. So coding conventions are style guides for programming. So we have things like naming and declaring rules for variables and functions, like what you name. We've already talked about this briefly in variables and function naming, the camel case. Then there are rules for white space, when you can leave white spaces, when you cannot, like a blank space. What should be the indentation, how the comments should be. And there are some coding principles and practices. So let's quickly jump on to a few of the things that we were going to talk about. The first thing that we're going to talk about is the variable names. I know I'm repeating this, but let's go with it. The variable name should always be camel case, and the first letter should be a lowercase. So first name equals, let's say, Abhay. Last name equals Talreja. So that's how to define a variable. If you have something called as a, let's say you're doing a e-commerce website, you do something called as a price. Price is, let's say, $20.99, for example. And then there is a tax of, let's say, 10 cents on it. Just saying. Could be anything. And so the full price is equals to price plus tax. Now, the next thing is spacing. So it's very important that you give the right spacing. So let's say, for example, variable x is equals to y plus z. So you saw the way I have given spacing is around my operators I have one space, around my operator I have one space, and then there is a semicolon. So spacing is very important so that users can read what you're writing, and it's easier to read. You can definitely write it in this fashion too, but it's definitely less readable when the lines of code increases. So let's make sure that we have the right coding convention and the right spaces. Let's say if you are defining an array, for example, let's say variable x. Let me just comment this out. Variable x is equal, and let's give another variable. Variable y is equals to 10. Variable z is equals to 20. So that's why x is that. Let's give a variable my array equals, again we can use the same car example that we always have, and so on and so forth. So if you have an array, make sure you can put in anything you want here. Make sure you have a space after the comma. Make sure you have a semicolon. Make sure you have space around the operators. So that was spacing. Then the next thing comes is indentation. So remember, when you do function, you write your own function, let's say to Celsius, and you take the Fahrenheit as an input. You see, the moment you do this, the braces indent. So most of your modern editors will have all these features inbuilt where it will indent automatically depending on the codes that you put in. So I personally use Sublime Text, but if you use any other editor too, you have the option to customize it. And see, the next line, before even giving an indentation, the code itself, the browser has given an indentation of 2 spaces, it seems. One, it's a tab actually. So it already gave in a tab. So the general standard is, again, this is a debatable thing around the industry. So you give 4 spaces, which is general standard. There are developers who use 2 spaces. There are developers who use tabs, and who use tabs for 2 spaces or 4 spaces. So the tab value can change depending on what they want to do. Now it's very much possible, and there are tons of debate online as well as in any forum you see on space versus tabs. I will not get into this, but the general standard is to put 4 spaces and to follow whatever you have to, because All the editors mostly follow 4-space tab, so it's easier that way. And they also say that you should not use tabs for indentation because different editors interpret tabs differently. But for my personal experience, I've been using tabs and everything has worked fine to me. And we've already talked about the statement rule, which is end all your statements with a semicolon. But make sure you do not end your functions with a semicolon. So functions should not end with a semicolon, but any statement should end with a semicolon. Statement rules. So let's say I have an object person equals an object, and then I will go ahead and write first name equals, let's say Abhay, comma, go last name. I can use single quote or double quote, everything works. But again, you should be consistent here. See, both will work, but you have to be consistent. So make this either a double quote or a single quote. Age equals 30. And let's say eye color, I don't know, nobody will care for it, but let's just add another variable as black or brown. Blue is the best. Let me make my eyes blue. And then in this case object, you end with a semicolon. So make sure you always put a semicolon whenever you have statements. So also, if you note the statement, right, there are many things other than just the semicolon. So you need to put the opening bracket at the first line. So if you see, I've put the opening bracket at the first line. Same with function. You need to make sure you leave a space before the bracket and your bracket starts in the first line. Put the closing bracket on a new line. So always you put a closing bracket on the new line so that it ends where you started your variable declaration. Now, do not end a complex statement with a semicolon. So again, we already talked that functions could not be ended with a semicolon. But if it's a statement, you should end it with a semicolon. Similarly, we can see this behavior very well in loops. So let's say we write a for loop. For I is equals to 0, I is less than 5, I plus plus. Then you give space, bracket, enter, second bracket, and you come back. And now you can see that here I have left a space, after between equals I have left a space, between less than I have left a space, and here we don't need a space. So you leave a space after the semicolon too. So that's your for loop. And again, now seeing the cursor, you can see that there's a space between the bracket. The bracket starts here and the bracket ends here. And you do not put a semicolon for these kind of statements. Similarly, if you have an if condition, so you do a if. So many people, including myself, have been making these mistakes at times where I do not leave a space between the if thinking that it's fine, but it's not easier to read that way. So make sure you do that. Is less than 20, then you go out space, and then you open the bracket, and then you close the bracket down here. And if you want to give an else statement, you do a space, else, space, open the bracket, and then go down and close the bracket. And then of course do a tab and then start writing your statement. Do a tab and then start writing a statement. Okay, one thing I forgot to mention for the properties of an object was that when you give commas for every property, make sure the last one doesn't have any comma, because that indicates that there is no more content or no more attributes that will come in after that. And we have already talked about the line length. So make sure your length of the line is less than 80, and then break it into the new line so that it's readable. The another important thing is the loading. So when you see the script, right, now there's a script tag here. When you have another including script, let's say in the HTML body, at the end of the body you want to include a script source is equals to my script.js. You just do this and you close the script. If you note that I have not given any type out here, because type was supposed to be an optional thing unless type became the default text in JavaScript. So it should work. So avoid giving the type. It's not needed. Also, when you access HTML elements, remember we've been accessing demo. So these are case sensitive. So when you do a document.getElementById, Try to use the name of the variables even in HTML with lowercase. It's always good. So you can use a camel case, and that's always preferred. But usually in HTML we do a lowercase hyphen another lowercase, so everything has to be in lowercase. But we will, if you take up any HTML course, you'll probably learn about it. But just to be safe, make sure your variables start with the lowercase. Now there is one very important thing is, if you see the name of the files that we have, whenever you open anything, like you'll have a .js, .html, .css. JS is for JavaScript, HTML or HTML is for HTML, and the CS or the .css. Let me just write it down. So we have .html or .htm for HTML. We have .js for JavaScript. We have .css for CSS files. Now the only thing you need to make sure that you remember is have your file names, which is JavaScript, also myscript.js or something like that. The reason being some servers do not support uppercase or any file name which is starting with uppercase. So let's say if you have a loading.js, so loading.js, and then you start loading.js, many servers do not appreciate L in uppercase for the file names. So it's always a good practice to make sure that your file names are in lowercase. Now, performance from the coding convention perspective, there is no performance if you leave white spaces. I know even I had this question when I was learning to level up. These spaces will not be a problem from the performance perspective, but they definitely help in readability and maintainability. And for production applications, usually what we do is there's something called as a minification, or you can have a minified JavaScript version. So you can have a development version which is all very well white spaced and everything is perfect so that you can read it. And for production, you usually use a minified version where even your variable names are reduced to a, b, underscore c or things like that. You can't read, you can't understand it. So that was a little bit about the style guide and the coding conventions. In the next lecture, we'll probably be discussing more on the best practices of JavaScript.